The fluorescent lights in the exam room were harsh, the kind that drained the color out of everything. A doctor was there, a nurse, a caseworker from child services. Security had already been called because the boy had been yelling and refusing instructions. He was 9 years old. Staff believed they were dealing with a behavioral issue, agitation, maybe something psychological. He stepped down from the hospital bed and turned toward the wall. He began backing up slowly until his heels touched it. When his heels made contact, he didn't stop. His feet pressed flat against the surface and his body followed. He didn't climb, he walked. Step by step, he moved up the vertical plane of the wall until he reached the ceiling. Then he flipped and landed back on his feet. And that's when the room stopped, feeling like a hospital. What you just heard was one moment in a case that unfolded over several months. By the time that hospital report was written, the family had already been dealing with disturbances inside their home. It didn't begin with a child walking up a wall. It began with smaller incidents in a rental house in Gary, Indiana, the kind of things that are easy to question or dismiss on their own. But the situation didn't stay contained inside the house. It began drawing in other people, police officers, school officials, social workers, medical staff, different witnesses, each documenting what they said they observed. The hospital incident wasn't treated as a single dramatic event. It became part of a larger investigation involving the state, the church, and eventually the media. Some details of the case were later amplified. Others were challenged. The house itself would eventually be demolished. But beneath the headlines and the arguments is a documented sequence of events involving a real family and multiple professionals who believed they were witnessing something they couldn't easily explain. To understand how it reached that hospital room, you have to go back to the beginning. I'm your host, Robert Barber. Tonight, we're looking at a documented case from 2011 in Gary, Indiana, where a family reported escalating disturbances inside their home. The claims eventually involved police officers, medical professionals, child services, and clergy. What began as activity inside a rental house moved into a hospital room and became part of official state documentation. Years later, the story made national headlines and sparked debate about what actually happened. The case would later become widely known as the Demon House. This is the story of the Ammons Demon House in Gary, Indiana. Let's get into it. In 2011, LaToya Ammons moved her family into a rental house on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. It was a narrow brick house with a small patch of grass out front and a chain-link fence along the side. The paint around the windows was chipped. The porch steps creaked when you walked up them. Inside, the hallway ran straight back towards the kitchen, with the stairs rising tight along the wall. She lived there with her mother and her 3 kids. Backpacks landed near the door. Shoes stayed wherever they were kicked off. The kitchen table filled up with mail, school papers, and whatever had to be dealt with later. In the evenings, the television stayed on low while somebody finished homework under the light above the sink. You could hear the neighbors sometimes, a car starting outside, someone arguing down the block. It felt lived in, tight, close. There weren't any stories tied to the address, no warnings from the landlord, and no reputation that was attached to it. They moved in because they needed somewhere stable. If something made a noise upstairs, it would have been one of the kids moving around. If something fell in the kitchen, somebody probably bumped the counter. That's how the house felt at the start. Not long after they moved in, one of the kids told LaToya he saw someone standing near the basement stairs. He said it looked like a person just standing there, and then it was gone. LaToya brushed it off. New house. Kids adjusting. It didn't feel like something to panic over. A few days later, they were all sitting in the living room when the lights flickered. It wasn't a long outage, just a quick shift in brightness, enough that more than one person looked up at the ceiling. Around that same time, flies started gathering near the back door and along the kitchen window. It was winter. The windows were shut. At first, LaToya figured one of them had gotten in when someone opened the door. But it wasn't just one or two. They clustered along the glass and in the corners of the frame, dark patches that stood out against the light coming in through the window. She cleaned the counters, took out the trash, sprayed the door frame and checked the seals. She looked for cracks in the caulking and gaps around the trim. The next day, they were back, in the same places. She cleared them away again, and again they returned. After a while, it stopped feeling like something that had simply gotten inside. It felt like something that kept choosing that spot. Around that same time, the kids began talking about hearing footsteps on the stairs after they've gone to bed. The staircase rose straight from the living room. The wood was old and carried sound. When someone walked on it, you heard it. One night, her youngest woke up screaming. She ran into the bedroom and found him sitting upright in bed, breathing fast, pointing toward the corner near the dresser. She flipped on the light. The room was empty. She stayed beside him until his breathing slowed. Over the next several days, the kids said it wasn't just noises anymore. They said they felt someone touch them while they were trying to sleep. A tug at his shirt, weight pressing into the mattress near their legs. One afternoon, while everyone was in the living room, the blinds on the front window shifted. The windows were shut. There wasn't a draft, and the air in the room felt still. The slats lifted slightly, then dropped back into place. Everyone in the room saw it. LaToya walked over, pressed the blinds flat against the glass, and stood there watching them. They didn't move again. The incidents started happening closer together. A door that had been closed would be open again later. Small items turned up in rooms where no one remembered putting them. The kids stopped wanting to sleep alone. LaToya began leaving lights on overnight and eventually started sleeping on the couch so she could hear the staircase in the hallway. By then, the house didn't feel new anymore. It felt watched. One night, LaToya came downstairs and saw a quilt spread across the living room floor. It was the thick blue one that usually stayed folded over the back of the couch. Her youngest was curled up on top of it with his shoes still on. The room was dark except for the lamp beside him that threw a yellow circle across the carpet and part way up the staircase. When she asked why he wasn't in bed, he kept staring at the stairs. He said he wasn't going back up there. The staircase rose straight from the living room. From where she stood, she could see halfway up. The hallway light upstairs was off, and the top landing sat in shadow. She walked to the bottom step and turned on the hall light. Nothing moved. She went upstairs anyway. She checked the bedrooms, opened closet doors, looked behind the shower curtain. The windows were locked. The rooms were still. When she came back down, he was still sitting there watching the stairs. After that night, none of the kids wanted to sleep upstairs alone. A few evenings later, the family was in the kitchen when one of the boys slammed a cabinet door too hard. The sound echoed through the small space and carried into the living room. Almost immediately, the wood on the staircase shifted. It wasn't a loud crack. It was the sound those steps made when someone put weight on them. Everyone in the room heard it. They all looked toward the hallway. The stairs were empty. The house wasn't large. The rooms connected in a straight line. If someone walked from one end to the other, you would see it. LaToya began noticing how the quiet settled in between those moments. The refrigerator running, the furnace kicking on, the house holding its breath. Then one afternoon, in the middle of the living room, something happened that crossed a line. Her youngest had been standing near the couch. He was close enough that she could see the small scuff on the toe of his shoe. His shoulders pulled back sharply, like someone had grabbed him from behind. His chin lifted. His eyes rolled upward until only the whites showed. His mouth opened. When he spoke, the voice that came out didn't sound like his. It was deeper, strained. The words were slow and deliberate. He said, "It's time to die." His grandmother was in the room. Another adult relative was there too. They were close enough to see the muscles in his neck tighten as he spoke. He wasn't laughing, and he certainly wasn't playing. For a few seconds, his body stayed rigid, balanced in a way that didn't look natural for a child his age. Then it stopped. His body loosened all at once, and he dropped to the floor. The room stayed silent. After that, this stopped feeling like something they could manage inside the house. The children were taken to Methodist Hospital in Gary for evaluation. By then, enough concern had built that medical staff and child services were both involved. This wasn't a paranormal inquiry, it was a clinical setting. Doctors were looking for behavioral or psychological explanations. A nurse was in the room. A Department of Child Services caseworker was present. Security had already been called earlier because the youngest boy had been yelling and resisting instructions. Staff believed they were dealing with agitation, possibly a psychiatric episode. During the evaluation, the caseworker later wrote that she witnessed something that she couldn't explain. According to reporting on the Department of Child Services file, she stated that the boy began backing up toward the wall of the exam room. His heels touched it. Instead of stopping, he continued moving backward. She wrote that she observed him walk up the wall until he reached the ceiling, then flip over and land on his feet. That description was entered into the official DCS record. The report indicates that medical staff were in the room at the time, along with the child's grandmother. The caseworker described confusion among those present. There was no video recording, and the event exists in written documentation only. After that incident, hospital staff recommended further psychiatric evaluation. The situation shifted from a family complaint to a child welfare matter. The Department of Child Services opened a formal case. In the days that followed, the children were interviewed separately. According to the investigative file, each child described disturbances inside the home. Some details differed, others overlapped. The caseworker noted concerns about possible coaching, but also documented that the children appeared visibly fearful during questioning. Because of the reported events and concerns about the environment in the home, Child Services removed the children. They were placed temporarily outside the house while the investigation continued. From that point forward, the story was no longer contained inside a rental property. It was in hospital notes. It was in a DCS file. It was part of a custody proceeding. And once something enters the state record, it doesn't disappear quietly. After what happened at the hospital, Child Services stepped in and removed the children from the home while the investigation continued. LaToya went through psychological evaluations and parenting assessments. There were interviews, follow-ups, court oversight. The process was structured and clinical, the kind of review designed to determine whether the issue was environmental, behavioral, or medical. Throughout that process, she maintained that what had been happening in the house wasn't behavioral and wasn't medical. She believed it was spiritual. A local Catholic priest, Reverend Michael Maginot from St. Stephen Martyr Parish, became involved after being contacted about the case. He visited the property himself and later said in interviews that he believed something had occurred there that he couldn't easily explain within ordinary categories. He performed multiple blessings inside the house. When the activity, according to the family, didn't stop, he sought permission from church leadership to perform exorcisms on LaToya. The Catholic Church doesn't grant that lightly. Psychological and medical explanations are supposed to be considered first, and approval requires review before the ritual can move forward. Those exorcisms were approved and carried out privately. While all of that was unfolding, the custody case moved through the court system. LaToya completed the evaluations that were required. Over time, the children were returned to her care. Eventually, the family left the house on Carolina Street. The property returned to being just another rental on the block, but the story attached to it didn't fade. Police reports had been requested. Hospital records had been cited. The Indianapolis Star had published a detailed investigation that included excerpts from official documentation. What started as a crisis inside one household had turned into a public debate. Some readers saw something supernatural, while others saw a family under stress in a situation that escalated. The house was still standing, and the argument around it was growing. In 2014, Zak Bagans of the TV show Ghost Adventures bought the house on Carolina Street. He didn't tour it first. He purchased it sight unseen for $35,000 after the story had already started spreading. By then, people were driving past just to see it. The address had been shared online. News coverage had circulated. Neighbors noticed cars slowing down in front of the property. Some people parked and took pictures. Others stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes and then left. If you didn't know the backstory, nothing about it would have stopped you. It wasn't falling apart. It wasn't boarded up. It looked like every other small brick house on that stretch of road. Bagans said he wanted to investigate it himself and document what had happened there. Over the next 2 years, he filmed inside the house and eventually released a documentary titled Demon House. In interviews, he described the interior as heavy and unsettling. He said members of his crew felt affected while they were inside. He believed something about the location hadn't settled. Other people disagreed. Some argued that once a story reaches national attention, every sound and shadow starts carrying more weight than it normally would. They questioned whether documentation, media attention, and expectation were reinforcing each other. In January 2016, demolition crews showed up early in the morning. Equipment rolled into the yard. The front porch came down first. Then the roof collapsed inward. The walls followed. Neighbors stood nearby watching. A few recorded it on their phones. Dust rose as the structure came apart. Within a few hours, the house was gone. Bagans later said tearing it down was about safety. He claimed the location posed a risk and shouldn't remain standing. Skeptics offered different explanations. Some believed removing the structure prevented further investigation by others. Some pointed to liability. A house tied to a national story was going to keep drawing attention. Whatever the motive, the address no longer existed as a structure. The lot was left empty. There was no staircase, no basement, no living room. Just open ground where a documented case had unfolded. And once the physical space is gone, whatever happened inside it becomes harder to measure against something concrete. All that remains are reports, interviews, and people's accounts of what they experienced. Up to this point, everything you've heard follows the sequence laid out in police reports, medical notes, and Department of Child Services documentation. This wasn't a single incident report. It became a 77-page investigative file. Child Services tracked the family from the rental house to the hospital. There were interviews, observations, and follow-ups documented over months. Multiple professionals documenting what they were told and what they said they witnessed. That doesn't confirm a haunting. It doesn't confirm possession. But it does establish something important. This case moved beyond rumor. It entered official record. The Gary Police Department documented disturbances inside the home. A hospital social worker documented statements about a child walking up a wall. Medical staff documented behavioral concerns and recommended evaluations. Clergy became involved after medical and psychological explanations were explored. That sequence matters, because whatever someone believes about what caused the events, the response to them was real. Police responded. Doctors evaluated. Child Services opened a case. And once something is written down, signed and archived by the state, it exists in a different category than legend passed from neighbor to neighbor. That's where this case sits, between documentation and interpretation. The thing about this case is that it forces you into a position. You don't really get to stay neutral with it. You either dismiss it completely, or you sit with the possibility that something happened that doesn't fit comfortably inside normal explanations. And I understand why people land on both sides. There are pieces of this story that make skeptics lean forward. A struggling family, media attention, a documentary, a house that gets torn down. It's easy to see how narratives form around something like that. But then there's that hospital room. Because that part doesn't live inside a documentary. It doesn't live inside a haunted house tour. It lives inside official reports written by people whose jobs weren't paranormal investigation. If I had been standing in that room and watched a child move in a way that didn't make physical sense, I don't know how I'd explain that to myself afterwards. Maybe there's a rational explanation. Maybe there's something about perception, stress, and suggestion. That's possible. But if you personally witnessed something that looked like gravity had been interrupted, even for a second, it would change how steady the world feels. And that's what stays with me. Not whether the house was evil, and not whether the demolition proved anything. It's the idea that multiple adults walked out of a hospital room carrying something they couldn't comfortably explain. You don't have to decide what it was. You just have to decide how much uncertainty you're willing to live with. And that's where this story still presses. This has been State of the Unknown. The Ammons case doesn't end with a clean explanation. The house was demolished. The family moved on. The reports were filed away. What remains is a paper trail and a series of moments that people say they experienced in real time. Whether you see this as a case of psychological stress, environmental factors, spiritual interpretation, or something else entirely, one thing is clear. once multiple agencies became involved, the story stopped being private. It became documented. If you've been enjoying the show, leaving a rating or review in your podcast app really does help more people find it. On Spotify, it's just a tap of the stars. On Apple Podcasts, you can even leave a short written review. I read them all, and I appreciate every one. If you know of a case that would make a great episode, you can tell me about it by going to stateoftheunknown.com/contact. Until next time, stay curious, stay unsettled, because sometimes the most unsettling part of a story isn't what happened, it's that it was written down.